Elias Hawke Thornton swung his axe again. The silence of the northern Rockies in 1841, broken only by the sharp, metallic thwack and the agonizing, dull thud that followed. The axe head, a 3-pound felling pattern he'd carried from Missouri, was buried deep in a round of frozen pine, and it was stuck. Again. The air was so cold it felt like a physical weight, a presence that stole the heat from his hands the instant he removed his mittens to wrestle with the hickory handle. He grunted, rocking the axe back and forth, his knuckles scraping against the rough bark. The vibration of the stuck tool was a special kind of misery, a jarring shock that went straight up his arms and into his shoulders, a reminder of wasted effort. Around him the snow was deep, blue in the weak afternoon light. His small cabin, barely a dark shape against the pines, was 100 yards away, its chimney cold. He needed this wood, not just for warmth, but for survival. In this environment, calories were currency, and he was spending far too many just to free his only tool. This was the crisis of his winter. Not the wolves, not the isolation, but the simple, maddening physics of his axe. He'd spent the last 2 hours trying to split enough rounds to see him through the coming storm, and his woodpile had barely grown. What he had piled up was a monument to frustration. Half-split logs, splintered failures, and a scattering of chips that looked pathetic against the vast, indifferent snow. He finally wrenched the axe free, the popping of its release echoing in the stillness. He looked at the blade. It was sharp. He'd spent an hour on it by the firelight last night, drawing it across his whetstone until it could shave the hair from his arm. The edge wasn't the problem. The problem was everything else. The instant that perfect razor-thin edge passed through the wood, the flat cheeks of the axe followed, and the wood, frozen solid, gripped the steel like a vice. It didn't split, it just held on. It was an axe designed for felling, for cutting across the grain. But for splitting, for living, it was a failure. He was a trapper, a carpenter, a man who lived by his hands, and his primary tool was fighting him at every turn. That evening, by the weak flame of a tallow candle, he held the axe head, feeling its weight, its balance. It was a good tool, but it was the wrong tool. Or rather, it was the right tool used in the wrong way, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind outside, that if he couldn't solve this problem, this simple problem of the stuck axe, the mountains would eventually claim him. He didn't just need a sharper axe, he needed a smarter axe. The axe itself was a good one, or so he'd been told. It was a Kent pattern, forged in a smoky shop back east, with a decent steel bit forge-welded to a softer iron body. He had bought it at a trading post in St. Louis, a solid head of proven design, and he had hafted it himself on a piece of hickory he'd seasoned for 2 years, shaving it down with a draw knife until it fit his grip perfectly. He was proud of the tool. He had, like every other man on the frontier, been taught to maintain it with religious care. The standard wisdom was clear. A sharp axe was a safe axe, and a sharp axe was a flat axe. You used a good mill file to work out the nicks and dings, always filing toward the edge. Then you took a flat whetstone, maybe a Washita stone if you were lucky, spat on it, and worked the edge in circles, keeping the stone perfectly flat against the bevel. The goal was to produce a long, thin, V-shaped edge. An edge, as the old-timers said, that was too thin to see. And he had mastered it. His axe could sever a 3-inch sapling in a single silent slice. It was a beautiful tool for felling. But felling was only 10% of his work. The other 90% was bucking the logs to length and then splitting them for the hearth. And that was where the standard way failed him catastrophically. The first winter he had nearly given up. He'd swing his prized razor-sharp axe into a round of pine or aspen, and the thud of it sticking was the soundtrack to his misery. The thin, flat profile that was so perfect for slicing cross-grain was a disaster for splitting with the grain. It had no push. The flat cheeks offered no leverage to pop the wood fibers apart. They just slid into the cut and were immediately gripped. He'd spend precious minutes prying, wiggling and cursing, sometimes having to use a smaller hatchet to chop the axe out of the log. He'd tried other solutions. He'd tried a heavy, blunt splitting maul, but at 12 pounds it was a specialized tool, too heavy to carry on his trap lines and useless for felling. He needed one tool to do it all. He tried carving wooden gluts or wedges and hammering them in with the back of his axe, but this was slow and in the deep cold. The wood was so dense and stringy it would often just absorb the wedge. He was trapped. The common wisdom, the right way to sharpen an axe, was actively working against him. It was a method designed for the homesteads of Ohio, not the frozen heart of the Rockies. His frustration wasn't just physical, it was existential. Why was this not working? Why did everyone do it this way, if it was so inefficient? He began to suspect that the problem wasn't his execution. The problem was the design itself. In the spring of 1842, a different kind of man passed through his valley. He was not a settler, nor an American trapper. He was an old Swede named Gustafsson, a man who had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company for 30 years, and before that had been a forester in the deep woods of his homeland. He was a quiet man, with eyes the color of the ice on a high mountain lake, and he moved with an economy of motion that fascinated Elias. Gustafsson carried only one axe, a tool that looked ancient, the head worn down, and the handle a dark, polished patina. One morning, Elias was out, once again fighting a stubborn piece of birch. He swung. The axe stuck and he let out a low curse. Gustafsson watched, saying nothing. He just jested for the axe. Elias handed it over. Gustafsson ran his thumb not over the edge, but over the cheeks of the blade, the flat sides. He shook his head, a slight, almost imperceptible motion. "This is a tree killer," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not a woodmaker." He motioned for Elias to follow him to his own small camp. He pointed to his axe, which was resting against a log. "See?" Elias picked it up. It felt different. It was heavy, but balanced. He looked at the blade. The edge was sharp, yes, but the body of the blade, right behind the edge, was not flat. It was rounded. It was thick, but not like a maul. It swelled in a gentle, convex curve from the edge back to the eye. "Apple seed," Gustafsson said, tapping it, "like the inside of the apple. Not a flat V. It must be round." He picked up a log, a piece of knotty, stringy wood that Elias would have set aside to burn whole. With a swing that seemed almost lazy, Gustafsson brought the axe down. There was a sound Elias had never heard from an axe before. Not a thwack, but a crack. The wood exploded apart, the two halves falling cleanly away. The axe never stuck. It sank in, and the rounded, convex cheeks acted like a splitting wedge, forcing the wood fibers apart with an audible pop. Gustafsson explained in simple, direct language. A flat axe, it cut. he said. "It cuts deep, and the wood, it is cold, it is wet. It holds the steel, it does not want to let go." He pointed to his own axe. "But round. The round axe pushes. The cut is small, but the push is big. The wood, it must open. It has no choice." He showed Elias his sharpening stone. It wasn't a flat bench stone. It was a round, hand-held puck, a piece of sandstone he'd probably carried from the old country. He demonstrated the motion. Not a flat, static grind, but a rolling motion, following the curve, maintaining the appleseed profile. Elias watched, mesmerized. Everything he thought he knew about axes, about sharpness, about efficiency, was wrong. He wasn't just learning a new way to sharpen. He was learning a new way to think about physics. That night, Elias sat by his fire, not with frustration, but with a burgeoning electric sense of hope. He would rebuild his axe. The decision was terrifying. Gustafsson had moved on, following the meltwater north, leaving Elias alone with this new, dangerous knowledge. To do this, he would have to remove steel. He couldn't add it back. If he ruined the temper, or if he messed up the geometry, his only axe, his lifeline, would be destroyed. He would be left with a dull, misshapen piece of iron, and the next winter would be his last. He spent 2 full days just thinking, planning. He sat on his stool, the axe head in his lap, the hickory handle removed. He ran his callous thumb over the flat bevels, the shoulders of the V-grind. He could feel the problem now. It was too thin, too abrupt. He needed to blend it. He needed to create that smooth, convex curve. He sketched the shape in the ash on his hearthstone with a stick. First, the V of his current blade, then overlaid the gentle U of Gustafsson's. He laid out his tools. He had his best mill file, its teeth still sharp. He had his flat whetstone, but he also had a smaller, palm-sized stone he used for his skinning knife. He would have to use that, and he'd have to learn to roll his wrist, to never let it sit flat. He listed the problems to solve. Problem 1, the binding. The convex shape would solve this. Problem 2, edge durability. Gustafsson had mentioned this too. A flat edge, he'd said, is like a leaf. It is thin, it rolls, it chips. He'd tapped his own axe. But the apple seed, it has meat behind it. It has a spine. It is strong. It holds the edge. This was the second secret, the one the title of the video didn't even capture fully. The new profile wouldn't just split better, it would stay sharp longer, because the micro edge was supported by a mass of steel. It was a more robust geometry. He planned his sequence. He would start with the file, working slowly from a half-inch behind, the edge back. He would not touch the edge itself until the very end. He would draw file, creating the rough shape, blending the shoulder of the grind into the cheek. He would check his work constantly, holding it up to the light, feeling it. Then he would use the stones to polish it, to refine the curve, to make it seamless. He would wait for a clear, cold morning with good light. This was not maintenance. This was surgery. He would forge his axe a second time, not with fire, but with a file and a stone. On the third day, he began. He clamped the axe head in his small vise. He picked up the file. The first stroke was the hardest, a screech of steel on steel that set his teeth on edge. He was intentionally dulling his axe, a thought that felt like sacrilege. But he wasn't just dulling it. He was moving the edge, reshaping its very foundation. Shing, shing, shing. The sound of the file was his only companion. He worked slowly, draw filing, removing the high shoulder where the V-grind began. He was rounding it, blending the steep angle into the flatter cheek of the axe. This was not the work of minutes, but of hours. His arm ached, and his knuckles were raw from gripping the file. Metal filings, like dark grey dust, covered his workbench. He would stop, unclamp the head, and hold it up. He'd run his thumb over the curve. Not yet. It was still too angular. He filed again, this time with a rocking motion, letting the file roll over the steel. He was sculpting. He was an engineer, though he didn't know the word. He was manipulating applied physics through sheer tactile feedback after what felt like half a day. The profile was changed. The V was gone. In its place was a rough, file-marked convex curve. It looked fat. It looked blunt. He felt a moment of panic. Had he ruined it? He took a breath and trusted the process. Now, the stones. He picked up his small handstone, dipped it in water, and began to work, not flat, but in a circular rolling motion. He was polishing the file marks, refining the curve, making it perfectly smooth. The shing of the file was replaced by the smooth, quiet shrrr of the stone. He worked from the back of the curve forward, finally at the very end, addressing the edge itself. He held the stone at a steeper angle, but still rolled it, creating a micro-bevel that was itself convex, blending perfectly into the larger curve of the cheeks. When he was done, he held the axe head in the light of the setting sun. It was a different tool. It didn't have the gleaming, paper-thin edge of his old axe. It had a robust, smooth, rounded profile, like the breast of a diving bird. The edge itself was sharp, but it looked stronger. He wiped it down with bare fat, the dark, polished steel seeming to absorb the light. He hafted it, securing the head with a new wedge. It was done. It was balanced. It felt powerful. But the real test, the only one that mattered, was the woodpile. The next morning, Elias walked to the woodpile with a mix of dread and anticipation. The air was colder, the promised storm palpable in the metallic grey sky. The wind was picking up, and he had no time to waste. He picked his worst enemy, a big, knotty, stubborn round of pine that had defeated him 3 days prior. It was the log his axe had been stuck in when Gustafsson arrived. He set it on the stump. He took his stance, the newly handled axe feeling unfamiliar in his hands. He took a deep breath, focusing on the center. He braced himself for the jar, for the dull, vibrating thud of failure. He swung. He did not swing with all his might, but with a firm, controlled motion. The axe head descended. It struck the wood with a sound he had never heard before. It was not a thwack. It was a thwack followed instantly by a crack. The blade sank in perhaps 2 inches, and the entire round popped apart, the 2 halves flying off the stump and landing 6 feet apart in the snow. The axe itself, pushed out by the exploding wood, fell free. Elias just stared. He had not felt a single moment of stick. The rounded cheeks had acted like a hydraulic press, converting the vertical force of his swing into a horizontal, bursting force. He was breathing hard, not from effort, but from adrenaline. He grabbed another piece, a stringy, wet piece of aspen. He swung. Thwack, crack. It, too, exploded. He swung again and again. Thwack, crack, thwack, crack, thwack, crack. What had been a day of agonizing labor became an hour of rhythmic, satisfying work. The axe never stuck, not once. It bit, it pushed, and the wood simply yielded. It was a revelation. He felt a profound, almost spiritual relief. He was not just splitting wood, he was mastering his environment. He was no longer a victim of his tool, but its master. He looked at the axe edge, expecting to see chips or rolls from the frozen, knotty wood. The edge was perfect, it was pristine. The meat of the convex grind had supported the edge completely, distributing the shock. It had split better, and it had stayed sharp. This, he thought, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow despite the biting cold, this was not a trick. This was knowledge. This was the difference between surviving and thriving. His woodpile, a monument to his previous failures, was now, in less than an hour, a towering stack of split, usable fuel. The storm could come. He was ready. The legacy of that single modified axe spread slowly, the way all real knowledge does, from person to person, in quiet demonstration. That spring, when other trappers and the first few adventurous settlers began to filter through the valleys, they would stop at Elias's cabin, and they would all, without exception, marvel at his woodpile. It was always full, always neatly stacked. The pieces split to a uniform, efficient size. "You must spend all your days at the block, Thornton," one young settler remarked, his own hands blistered and raw. "Not so much," Elias replied. He would then offer to let the man split a few rounds. The man would pick up his own axe, a standard flat-ground felling axe, and swing. Thud. The axe would stick. The man would grunt, wiggle it free, and swing again. Thud. After a few minutes of this, Elias would wordlessly hand over his own axe. The man would look at the blade, puzzled by its blunt, rounded appearance, but he would swing. The crack of the wood popping apart would echo, and the man would look at the axe, then at Elias with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. "How?" they would ask, and Elias would show them. He didn't hoard the secret. For the price of a few skins or a bag of flour, he would sit down with his file and his stone and fix their axes. He called it putting the push in. The word spread down the trap lines and over the passes. "Go see Hawk Thornton. He's got away with axes. He can make a blade split like a maul but cut like a razor." The idea, that robust, convex appleseed grind, began to spread. Men who adopted it found their workloads cut in half. They spent less time fighting their tools and more time building, trapping, and living. They wasted less energy. Their axes stayed sharp longer, chipped less in the brutal cold, and were infinitely more versatile. It was no longer one man's trick, but a piece of shared, hard-won wisdom. Decades later, when the big logging companies moved in, their foreman would specify the axes their men used, and the best, most sought-after patterns, the Montana or the Rockaway, all shared one common subtle feature, a gentle convex cheek, a splitting grind that was born not in a factory but on a frozen woodpile in the middle of nowhere. What Elias Thornton and Gustafson before him had discovered intuitively was a profound engineering principle. The standard flat-ground axe of the 19th century was a tool of compromises, and it failed spectacularly when it met the reality of a frontier survivalist. The problem was physics, and the solution was geometry. A flat-ground V profile is designed to cut. It slices through fibers with minimal resistance. But when that cut is deep, the flat faces of the blade create immense surface area friction. In wet or frozen wood, this friction creates a suction, a binding force that grabs the axe and holds it tight. It turns the tool into an anchor. The appleseed or convex grind, by contrast, is a tool of displacement. The sharp edge initiates the cut, but immediately the rounded, swelling cheeks begin to push the wood fibers apart. This push breaks the friction. It acts as a compound wedge, transforming the downward force of the swing into a powerful outward bursting force. The axe ejects itself from the cut. But the second, and perhaps more critical innovation, was durability. The secret to the axe staying sharp longer was not some magic steel. It was, again, geometry. A thin, flat-ground edge is inherently weak. It's a tiny sliver of steel with no support. When it strikes a hard knot or frozen wood, the micro-edge rolls over or chips off. This is a dull axe. The convex grind, however, provides a shoulder of steel directly behind the final edge. It supports the cut. The force of impact is not concentrated on a razor-thin line, but is distributed through the larger curved mass of the blade. The edge is stronger, at a microscopic level, more resistant to the abuse of real-world work. It wasn't that the axe never got dull, it was that it resisted the damage that causes dullness for far longer. It was a perfect marriage of design and function, an intuitive understanding of metallurgy, mechanical advantage, and energy conservation, discovered by men whose lives depended on it. Elias Thornton lived to see the valleys fill with smoke and the mountains crisscrossed by telegraph wires. He died an old man, in a cabin built of logs he had split with that same axe. The tool itself, the head worn down by decades of filing and stonework, the apple-seed profile now faint but still present, was passed to his son and then his grandson. It was a tangible link to a time when survival was not a guarantee, but a daily, hard-won victory. The lesson of the axe was not, in the end, about steel. It was about thought. It was a lesson in challenging the standard way when that way was failing. It was about the quiet courage to change the very tool you depended on, risking everything on an idea. It was a profound insight into a universal truth. That brute force is the least efficient way to solve a problem. We are so often taught to just swing harder, to put more effort into a failing system. The axe teaches a different lesson. It teaches that the unseen part of the tool, the subtle geometry behind the edge, does the most important work. It teaches that the right shape, the right design can turn a day of brutal labor into an hour of quiet satisfaction. It is a reminder to look at the tools we use, the systems we accept, and the problems we face, and ask a simple question. Is this sticking? And if it is, perhaps we do not need more force. Perhaps we need a different shape. Perhaps we need to stop and think and find the courage to reprofile the blade.